Let's go for it. It's another episode of Film Streak. My name is Rob. What I do here, you know the deal. We watch new movies. And sometimes they're old movies, sometimes they're brand new releases. I just did a whole episode on films from this year that I just couldn't find a place to put them. Some of them I was really interested in, really enjoyed. Some of them, not so much. You know, it just goes that way. That's the way it happens. So that's okay. Here, look, we're at the end of 2024, and there's something that occurred to me sometime, I don't know, the middle of the year somewhere, where I was watching Unforgiven, maybe a few months ago. And it made me think for a second, where has Gene Hackman been? It reminded me, like that performance, his performance in that film is so great because there's so much happening in that film on an actual narrative level, but then also like on a meta level of Clint Eastwood and his kind of return to Westerns and all that. But Gene Hackman is doing some interesting stuff in that film. And so one of the things I wanted to look at was, where has he been for a while? You know, I know there was a period where he stopped acting and started to, it seemed like he was going to start writing books. And I know he did write a book called Pursuit. And I thought, oh, this is going to be great. We're going to see a whole different side of this person that has kind of been on the movie landscape for decades. And here we are now, we're in 2024, and it occurred to me, it's like, wait, it's been a minute. It's actually been a good amount of time since we've seen or heard or anything like that. So, you know, it's one of those things, like a moment of curiosity. I'm like, hey, what is Gene Hackman doing these days? And the only thing I could find was some paparazzi photos of him. I think it was maybe like somewhere in New Mexico. I think that's where he lives. And, you know, look, he's old. He's in his 90s at this point. And I wouldn't have expected to ever see Gene Hackman again. But the point of it was, wait, you know, it's been 20 years since the last film that he did. The last film that he was in was a film called Welcome to Mooseport. And I remember at the time, some of the word around the film was like, this isn't a great film. And if this is Gene Hackman's last film, which I think even at the time, it seemed like that was sort of the case. I don't know how people necessarily knew that, but it just seemed like, oh, this is the last thing we're getting Gene Hackman in? What? So I said, you know what? There are a lot of films that I'm familiar with and that I actually really enjoy and admire that Gene Hackman was a part of. But there are a lot of films that I don't know. And it's an interesting thing to do that, to look at a filmography of an actor, of a performer. And so, you know, before I do that, I want to kind of go down, I guess, my personal top 10, like some of my favorite appearances. I don't really like to do lists so much, but I feel like this was something where I needed to kind of, for myself, like get it straight. Like, wait, which films do I know him in? And which films do I think I know him in? And which films have I never even heard of? And so if we're talking like a top 10 list or at least 10 familiar roles that I kind of associate with Gene Hackman, I think for me, the first is The Conversation. You know, I remember watching that film, not when it came out, but, you know, sometime in the, I don't know, late 90s, early 2000s. And I just remember really kind of being intrigued and in a way, maybe kind of identifying with that a little bit. You know, here's a study, a kind of a portrait of this man who is a technician and very detail oriented, but also kind of just understated and maybe underestimated. And yet he's trying to do the right thing and be a bit of a righteous person to solve a mystery, and ends up getting caught up in other things, right? Bigger than himself. And so that movie, I mean, just the craftsmanship, of course, with the whole like sound design component to it, but the acting of it and some of the musical choices. And I think it's just it's a unique little gem that Francis Ford Coppola put together, and I think it still holds up. It's aged in some ways in terms of the technology or whatever, but some of the themes in it I think still resonate today. For me as a kid, Gene Hackman, I think I first recognized him or saw him in Superman as Lex Luthor. And, Superman, and I think Superman 2, I know Superman 2, but I think there was another Superman, one of those films that he was in again. At the time, I didn't really understand, because I would have been like, I don't know, 7 years old or something. I didn't even really understand the whole mythology or whatever of Superman and Lex Luthor and their dynamic and their struggle against each other and all that. So I just thought, oh, this guy just seems kind of fun. I mean, he's the bad guy. He's the character. He's the villain who is going up against Superman, but it's not an even match. So he's got to have something else. He's different in some other way. And Gene Hackman's portrayal of that is kind of delightful, but also kind of sinister, but more just scheming. And I think for a kid, it just stuck with me as like, who is this guy? Who is the guy that can go up against Superman? That was probably my first impression of him. But then, I mentioned a while ago, Unforgiven. That to me is probably one of the lasting impressions. The performance he gives in that, he's kind of the villain of the film, but he's also not wrong. He's trying to look out for his community and for his people and uphold the law. And yet he's taken some pretty extreme measures to get there. And I can't really say I agree with how the film ends, but I think that's the point of the film, is that this sort of bleak, cynical outlook on law and order and who's right and who's wrong, it doesn't always go the way you expect. So I just remember thinking there's enough in that film that he's doing that is showing us a range, not just of his performance or whatever, but the character, the development of that character, to have multiple sides to him, that you want him to be right and you want him to succeed, but also you want the other guy to succeed and you want his character to get out of the way. And so for me, the earliest film that I've seen of Gene Hackman's is The French Connection. I think that was like 1971. And I saw that much later, probably as, I don't know, someone in my 20s. And, at that point, it was more about like, well, you got to understand like its place in cinematic history. Before that, I had seen probably parts of the film, and I had seen the car chase, that I think important car chase in the film that outside of the film itself, like even just out of context, is pretty amazing. But watching the whole film and understanding it with a little more of an adult perspective, I could really see like, oh, this is not about just a cop looking for the bad guys. This is about a questionable cop. And so that's where I thought, oh, this is much more nuanced than I probably would have expected. And so with The French Connection, I think from what I can tell, that's probably the film that really broke Gene Hackman, that like made him a star, made him a face, a name, right? And even though that's based on a real story, Popeye Doyle and his time with the NYPD, that film, it kind of left like a tale, right? Like it has a lasting legacy. It left an influence on so many other films that came after it. Whether you're talking about films about anti-heroes or you're talking about films about police in general, or just the crime organizations that are out there in the world and how like real people on the ground got to deal with that. Like, I think that film, it has a legacy beyond just, cop dramas. And another film that sticks out to me is much more recent, and it's probably one of the last great performances that he gave, is Crimson Tide. It's a Tony Scott film. It's an action film, but it's all claustrophobic. It's contained to this one submarine. And so it's doing a lot of different things at the same time. And yet him and Denzel going head to head, some of those scenes, they're just like fire. It's just like magic. And he brings enough of that sort of gruffness, but also the kind of charm and a little bit of the edge that you need for someone in that role. You know, that character that he plays in that captain of the boat is someone who is trying to do the right thing, sort of like the character in Unforgiven, right? He's trying to do the right thing. He's trying to follow his orders, and yet he's being questioned and might ultimately end up being wrong. And so I always thought that was a film that stood mostly on the work of Tony Scott and his ability to create that kind of tension, that kind of an atmosphere for a story. You know, the energy of it, the editing, the music, and all of those components that go into an action film, but really make it mostly about these two men kind of duking it out mentally, right? So Gene Hackman brings his game to that film, and I think it really elevates it. Because if you put somebody who isn't quite that in that role, it doesn't work. And vice versa, I think. But that's one that really kind of stands out to me, and it feels more modern. It feels more contemporary. You know, a lot of the films that Gene Hackman did throughout his career were much earlier decades. We're talking 60s, 70s, 80s. And some of them, they don't hold up so well. But Crimson Tide, I think, really still kind of works. It feels like a pretty modern film for the most part. Another film that I think it kind of shows its age a little bit, but I feel like it sits just right in where it is Get Shorty. You know, that's a film that he's not the star of it. He's really kind of not even the second character. I mean, he's not even the title character, but it's such a fun and delightful and charismatic performance he gives in that, but also kind of slimy. And I think it's such a different take for the kind of roles, like most of these roles that I'll talk about here, and even some of the newer films that I've seen. This isn't the kind of character he plays. He's kind of, in Get Shorty, he's this producer who is basically just kind of getting pushed around the whole time. And even when he tries to show some backbone and tries to be a tough guy, we quickly find out he's really not that, you know? And it's just, it's more just fun watching him have fun playing the role that I think it makes it enjoyable. Another film that is around that same era, but it's also a supporting role, is The Firm. And it's hard to probably upstage Tom Cruise in a Tom Cruise movie, but Gene Hackman comes in a really close second in that film. And when we're introduced to that character as being mostly on the good guy's side, but ultimately not necessarily being on the good guy's side, I think that character lives in such a gray area, and it's a real, like a human space to live in. Like, this character is someone who wants to help Mitch succeed and be his mentor and show him the ropes and all that. But he's probably looked the other way a few too many times, and now he's compromised himself, and it all starts to catch up with him, right? And I think that's a really interesting place to sit for a character, but also for an actor, right? Like, how do you kind of navigate that and make it come across? And so, you know, there's a couple others here, and, you know, Hoosiers is one that I saw much later in life. Like, I never saw it in the 80s. I didn't play sports and all that. So it was never a thing where, like, oh yeah, remember Gene Hackman and Hoosiers. But I always heard about that. And I didn't really see it until maybe like in the last 10 years. Look, I think the film doesn't really age so well. I feel like it's got some filmmaking problems, and I think it's even got some performance problems. But Gene Hackman in that, I think he is the anchor for that thing. And that film doesn't work without that character being solid. And so the idea that he carries that entire film and really makes it still work, I think that's a big testament to his ability, to his talent. to ground a film like that, but also make it feel somewhat real and somewhat authentic, even if other things around him aren't quite working the same way. Another one that I thought was interesting, kind of like Crimson Tide, is you've got Enemy of the State. And he's not really a big part of that film. He's in it for a portion of it. It is a Will Smith film. But just like Crimson Tide, it's like you need someone that can go head to head with Will Smith in some of those scenes and really make a point of like, hey, look, stop. This is what's happening, right? Like someone who can kind of take over for a minute and help this character who we are following understand what's going on. And I think he does a pretty great job in that. And for me, I think that was probably a different turn because like here's Gene Hackman in like a straight up action film. Like there really aren't many action films that he's been in. And I'll go through some of them. And I mean, if you talk about the ones that I've just listed, I guess Crimson Tide is sort of an action film. I don't really see it as that. Is the French Connection an action film? I kind of don't feel like it is either. But Enemy of the State, it is one of those like early waves of like cyber thrillers, right? But also got like this political intrigue component to it. And so I just thought it was really fun to see Gene Hackman in like a straight up action film. And then one of the last here, let's round out the 10 and say The Birdcage. And here, I think this is Gene Hackman doing what he does best and living in his space and owning his lane, where he is not the lead actor. He's not even a secondary character in that. He is like really far down the list, not first on the call sheet by any means. But what he brings to that film is a sort of weight and a kind of a dry sense of humor and wit. And it makes the film work because you've got Robin Williams and Nathan Lane so far over on one end of the spectrum in terms of their broadness and the sort of big energy that they're bringing to the film. You need someone to kind of pull it in the other direction and really balance it out. And Gene Hackman is that. And, he's not in most of the film. He's only in a handful of scenes, if I remember right. But there is a necessity for that, and I think his whole setup in that film is that he's like a senator, like a disgraced senator who just needs to like hide out for a while. So he goes to visit this couple and their son, and it's got like a family kind of thing going on. And yet there's a sort of ownership of this. I want to say like elder statesman or the authority figure or the congressman, the community leader, the politician, whatever you want to call it, like the figure of authority that Gene Hackman kind of has lived in for a lot of his roles. Like if you look at them, and I'm going to look at them, whether you talk about Unforgiven, whether you talk about Crimson Tide, even The Firm or Get Shorty, a lot of these films, he plays either a cop, a lawyer, a politician, someone in a higher regard, higher status than other characters in the story. Sometimes he is the person like driving the story. Other times he is the person like pulling the story in other directions or like supporting the story. I just thought that's interesting to look at that over time and see like how his choices evolved or maybe just kind of fell into a nice, comfortable spot, And of course, before I get into any of these films, I had to look at like, well, who's Gene Hackman now? Like, let's say Gene Hackman is done. Like, we'll never see him in another film, which I think is pretty safe to say at this point. Who's doing that now? Who's filling that void? Because there's a very specific kind of character and a style that Gene Hackman brings to films and to his work that I don't think a lot of actors can do. There's that sort of strange, but also very real combination of like gruffness and grit and edge and anger, but also a sort of tender and humble, and I wouldn't even say sometimes fun side to him. There a lot of these films, there's a moment in almost all of them, or in many of them, let's say, where he does his chuckle, and it's a Gene Hackman signature. It's like it's kind of like the Tom Cruise kind of grin. Like it's just when you see it, you're like, ah, there he is. And I feel like there's not a lot of actors that do that have that sort of combination. And the fact that, look, I mean, Gene Hackman, he's a big guy, he's 6'1" or something like that. And he's not necessarily like, he doesn't have like movie star looks, but he has movie star presence. And I think that's where it's such a specific place that he can be in some of his roles that I don't know who else could do it. And that's why I think it's so unique that Gene Hackman not only found success and was due success, but maintained it for so many years, and has really kind of built a legacy, I think. Now, all that said, there were a ton of films that I had maybe heard of and just never seen, or had never heard of at all, like entirely. And so this is where Film Street comes in handy, because now I can go and look at some of these films. I don't know if I necessarily want to go in chronological order, but let's say, French Connection 2, right? I knew there was a sequel, and I probably had seen it at some point way back, I don't know, in the 80s or 90s, but I couldn't remember it at all. And so I had to go back and watch that, because I think for such a star-making role by a filmmaker who went on to have his own legacy, but also to create a real presence for Gene Hackman himself, I was like, okay, what is the sequel like? And so to find out, it wasn't directed by William Friedkin, it was directed by John Frankenheimer, who was also, an established veteran filmmaker with his own sort of style. I thought, this is going to be something big. And, I very loosely remember that it's about Popeye Doyle going to Europe to chase the bad guy from the first film. But I really forgot, like, there's a whole part of that is him getting caught up in the investigation and ultimately like kind of getting abducted and getting strung out, and like Popeye Doyle really getting turned, if that's the right way to say it. It's like we see a whole different side of this character, a character who is so like desperate, so hungry to catch the bad guys, that he goes so far under that he loses himself. And yet I think there's still that sort of conviction of the character to like bring it together, like to get it right. And I don't know if that's part of the conclusion of the first film, where it is kind of darker and it kind of ends on a down note, like the bad guy gets away. And my take on it was, it's not quite as, gritty and frenetic as the first film. I think the first film, it really has like a documentary feel. It's clearly scripted and it's got performers in it, but it is a thing where it doesn't feel like it's planned. It doesn't feel like it's intentional. It's just like this is what's happening. We just happen to point cameras at it. Whereas the second film, it feels more staged. It feels more like structured. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's just a very different approach. And I think it's a little bit striking compared to the first, when you have this character who is just kind of running ragged to catch the bad guys. And then in the second film, he kind of gets caught up in it all. And, maybe it's even like a little bit of a do-over, right? Because we do get the bad guy at the end. And I think, there's probably a good portion of audiences that didn't understand like the end of the first film. Like, oh, this is how it ends? Like the bad guy gets away? And so maybe this is a way to kind of, I don't know, kind of right that wrong, if you want to say. And in that way, I feel like overall, like the film tries to fall in line more with conventional sort of storytelling or like what an audience would want versus stay true to this story, stay true to maybe reality. And like it doesn't always work out. The good guys don't always win. And, you know, I don't know the reaction of the time. I don't know if it was as successful or more successful somehow, but I just feel like it's a very different kind of film than the original. So, you know, if I kind of just follow a little bit of a timeline here, there's a film called The Domino Principle that I saw. This and another film that I want to talk about, Target. These two films, they are about these characters they've got a past and they've got a history, and some of it is kind of hidden away. You know, in The Domino Principle, he plays a character who is a Vietnam veteran who lands in prison, and ultimately there's this kind of secretive, kind of shady agency, let's say. I mean, let's just call it the CIA. But these agents, these men, find him in prison and they offer him a deal. It's like, we'll get you out of prison. We'll get you back. You can see your wife. You can live a life again, but you've got to do something for us. And that premise on its own, I feel like we've seen plenty of films that follow that same type of premise, but there's something about the execution in this film. I don't know if it's a product of the times. It just feels very like TV movie-ish, you know, it just, and if you don't remember, if you weren't around to see TV movies, like in the 70s, 80s, probably into the 90s, you know, they were films that were produced basically like a theatrical film, but they were produced on the budget of television, and they were mostly hung on these very conventional, sort of traditional structures that a TV audience could watch and have no problem dealing with, right? They wouldn't be challenged necessarily. And this film and Target, another film a few years later, they are about these characters that are in these situations. And yet, when you look at the way the films are produced, whether it's like some of the action or the production quality, or even like some of the acting. I mean, some of the acting it veers off into like soap opera territory. And Target, you know, he's a character who he's got a wife and a son. The wife goes to Europe. She ends up missing. So then he and his son, played by Matt Dillon, they go to Europe to find her. When they're there, they discover, there's actually some kind of plot, because we know that you used to be a secret agent and now you are going to have to help us in order to get your wife back. And Matt Dillon there is the son, and he kind of gets caught up in things, and there's just enough like melodrama in it that it feels kind of unnecessary versus like, let's get straight to the point. Let's drive this thing. And I think it's just more of a product of the times. You know, I feel like if you made these films based on these premises, or maybe even this exact story, if you made them today, they'd be much faster paced and move with a different speed and a different energy. Probably have much more production to them. These feel pretty plain, pretty basic, you know? And it's hard to look past that now, especially if you know, like, this is how they made things for television back in the day. You know, you watch like an episode of Hunter or like TJ Hooker, you're probably not far from where this film is. Now, the difference is, you know, it can have more violence and language and sex in it or whatever, but it still just feels like something you would have watched on like a Friday night on NBC. And, you know, I got to say, at least in terms of Gene Hackman, I think for the most part, he's doing his Gene Hackman thing. He's in the Gene Hackman lane. But it's just a lot of stuff going on around him. It just doesn't really land. You know, it feels kind of half-assed. So whether you consider the stories or the themes in some of these films interesting, I don't know if I really identified or they didn't really hit with me. And I think it's an interesting thing to look at, like an actor kind of choosing roles based on maybe what's available or what they're getting. Maybe there's something to identify with, but I think a lot of it is like, well, it's kind of like it's keeping the wheels turning, you know, it's keeping the name out there. But I think there are other films, there are like waves of films that come along that we see where an artist or specifically an actor can find new wind in their sails. Another film I want to talk about here, kind of in this same era, late 70s, early 80s, is a film called Eureka. And I think this was one of those attempts to like, all right, we're going to do something different. And this is a film by Nicholas Roeg, and it's got Gene Hackman. It's got actually kind of interesting cast. You know, it's got Rutger Hauer, Teresa Russell, Mickey Rourke, Joe Pesci's in this. Like, it's such an interesting cast and a really interesting story. I think it's just the execution again. It's so strange. Like, this is such a strange film. Like, I think I read a couple things about like this is sort of loosely based on the sort of structure or a very similar type of story to Citizen Kane, right? But it's also based on a real thing that happened, a real murder and real people. And yet I can even see a parallel to a film that came much later, of course, but something like There Will Be Blood. You know, Gene Hackman in this film, he plays a prospector who finds gold, and he kind of lands into this life of riches and luxury and excess. And yet it's nothing but trouble for him. And eventually, I mean, there's a point where he has a family, he has this home, he builds this like estate in Jamaica, of all places. And that's where things start to come off the tracks, you know? And I got to say, look, this film is very strange. It starts out really interesting and kind of even a little poetic, you know, where we see him discovering the gold and we see him like in the snow, and it's, you know, the landscape, the sort of territory that this film starts in is very different than where it ends. But once we get to his life of riches and his family and all of that, it becomes very dark and very kind of, I don't know, it leans into like, I think some sort of like mystical elements or whatever, because you have this strange like the culture clash in Jamaica. And you have this sort of dynamic, the relationship between the family and the friends. And I think Joe Pesci is in there to sort of be like the mob presence, right? Sort of injecting their own will into this man's life. This film, for all of its weirdness, it has it has one of the most gruesome murder scenes or whatever that I've ever seen in a film, I think. I mean, it is graphic, but also just the sort of depravity of it. And because here, I'll save you the time of watching the film, because I don't ultimately think the film is that great. But, you know, Gene Hackman, he plays his character, and he ends up kind of getting assassinated, really. It's like some men, you know, find their way into his home, and they basically beat him, right? Just beat him almost to death. And he's in this bed. He's all bloody, his head like bashed in. And they start lighting him on fire with a blowtorch, like melting him. Like you see his face, and then they start to like cut off his head. And it is so, I mean, and it's shown. And I don't know exactly, it's one of those where I'm like, I don't really know how they did this, because it looks pretty convincing for the time, right? For being that era of filmmaking, visual effects, special effects, whatever. It's like, how did they do this? Because this looks too real. And so, you know, that aside, like this film is just strange, and I don't really know where to put it. I don't. I don't know if I didn't really enjoy it. I don't really know if I fully understood it, like what it was getting at. That and some of the acting in it is so kind of the time. Again, it feels very soap opera ish. There's this whole court sequence at the end, the courtroom. It turns into a courtroom drama, and Teresa Russell is giving like testimony, and she's being like interrogated or cross-examined or whatever, and it really just turns into like soap opera. And by the end, I think we're supposed to maybe have a little bit of a conclusion, but also like leave a little bit of mystery of like, well, what happens next? But by the time we get to the end, it's like, who cares anymore? Like, this film is so off the rails. And it's a shame because I feel like Gene Hackman is the one that does all the work in this movie. Like, we see him at different stages in life, and I think he's the one that's supposed to kind of hold it all together. But once he's gone, I think you feel it. It's like the film just loses any kind of focus. So I don't know. I can't really say I enjoyed it. I can't really recommend it. I mean, if you're a Nicholas Roeg fan, maybe you see something about it that I'm just not seeing. But yeah, I can't really go with it, And that brings me to a couple of others, and these are also still in the 80s because I feel like there was a period where things started to change. And I don't know if it's either one of these films. I have a good feeling about one of them. Uncommon Valor, 1983. This is a strange film because for years I saw the cover of this film and it's like Gene Hackman and it's like black and white or like duotone or whatever. And it looks like a really kind of rugged, intense war film. And this film kind of starts that way. We see like this sort of Vietnam era story taking place. And then we kind of jump forward in time and we see that, his character is assembling this group of veterans that are going to basically go back and find their friends, find the POWs still left over there. So there's a component of this that feels very kind of Rambo-ish, right? The fact that it's directed by Ted Kotcheff, who directed First Blood, I think that says a lot. Okay, we've got familiar territory for this filmmaker. And meanwhile, I mean, this isn't quite First Blood. This isn't quite Rambo, even though it's living in some of that same water, because it's also a little bit of like the Dirty Dozen, right? It's this kind of ragtag group of people who are good at what they do, but maybe they don't all quite get along. And how are we going to make this mission work? How are we going to actually pull this off to go get our buddies and save some people? And there's this kind of, I don't know, this kind of like corny type of comedy slant to it all. We got a young Patrick Swayze in this film who is the kind of new kid who's trying to like lead the team, and they don't respect him. They don't recognize his sort of role in the thing. And that he's got to step up and kind of take charge in a way. And I mean, that's an interesting dynamic to throw into it, but I just think it never really kind of ties together, especially when like Gene Hackman, like you're the main guy here, right? Like get this team together, do your thing. And so there's a point where this film like kicks into gear, right? Where we're done like assembling the team. We're done like getting the plan together and the training montage and all that. And things start to happen. And at that point I thought, all right, here, now we're going to finally get to like the real action, the meat of the film. Watching it, it's like, back into like we're still in 80s TV territory. Like it's not there, I mean, I had a distinct feeling watching this film. I'm like, this is the kind of Vietnam War movie that Tropic Thunder makes fun of. This type of movie is that subject of the parody. And it's a shame because I feel like there's some good intentions with this, but like it's kind of living with one shoe in like this heavy, intense action sort of dramatic territory. And then the other shoe is in this kids outside playing territory. And it's hard to reconcile the two because I want to take it seriously, but there are moments and things about it that I just can't. It's like you just see right through it. Like this is just a corny ass movie. And so, here's where I just feel like, man, this is now a run in the late 70s and early 80s where it really isn't working out so much for Gene Hackman, other than Superman. Other than that character in those films, I think he's balancing it with some of this stuff, which is really weird. I think here is where I see the turn, though. 1989, The Package. And I think this is a matter of Gene Hackman finding the right role with the right filmmaker, with the right co-star, with the right villain or like counterpart. And I think now we get something that feels more like, oh, this is a real thing. This is designed to work. This is not just some people putting ideas together. This is like a real crafted piece of work here. We have Andrew Davis before The Fugitive, before even like Under Siege or whatever. And he's clearly living in like his Chicago era, right? I mean, he's a Chicago filmmaker. A lot of his films take place there. Have people who are from there. It's just a very kind of distinct vibe, I think. And this film, it's Gene Hackman going up against Tommy Lee Jones, essentially. Even though they have scenes together and they feel like they're kind of on the same wavelength until we start to see, oh, well, there's something going on with Tommy Lee Jones' character. He's not what he says he is. You've also got Joanna Cassidy in this, who is a very kind of strong and present supporting character who kind of helps drive the plot even. And then look, and it's Andrew Davis, it's Chicago. You've got some faces that show up that feel very much of that time and place, whether it's someone like Ron Dean or Chelsea Ross. You got Dennis Franz in this, who is like Chicago through and through. And so it just really kind of lives in that vibe. And I think it works because I just feel like for the time, for 1989, like this is something very different. And this is right on the heels of Above the Law, right? Which is Andrew Davis also doing his thing in Chicago with Steven Seagal. But here you've got like a, not so much of an action star, but you've got a real actor doing stuff. 2 actors, 3 actors, whatever, right? You've got a really solid cast here. And it's built around a very timely, but also still kind of relevant story. It's about this sort of plot to assassinate, politicians or government leaders. And I feel like that's a thing, strangely enough, maybe, I don't know, but all these years later, it's still a thing that lives in the air. It's still a thing that we understand and we know about and we have to be concerned about. And so this film, I think it has a very kind of strange and useful relevance even today. 35 years later, is that what we're looking at? 1989? Yeah, all these years later. And I think this film, from what I can see, like just kind of piecing together these films and the other films I've seen, it's probably between this and Mississippi Burning that I think really kind of change the course of things for Gene Hackman, I think. You've got a few other films in here. You got No Way Out. You've got some other ones. But these, I think, show him leaning into that sort of, that Gene Hackman lane of the person of authority, the person of accountability, of responsibility, but also not always doing the right thing, but he's doing what's needed. And yet he's not always pleasant about it. He's not always on time with it, but he's still, that's his kind of drive. I think there's an interesting thing. We don't really see Gene Hackman play a lot of straight, like out and out villains. There are a few, but most of the time it's like, I can see where he's coming from. And even in this film, he's a guy who's kind of gotten on the wrong side of some people, and yet he's trying to do the right thing. And so, we find this really specific place that Gene Hackman kind of lives in. And so another film here from 1991 is a film called Company Business. And this is with Gene Hackman playing opposite Mikhail Baryshnikov, who, strange career there, I feel like, but interesting career. But this is on the heels of so much change that was happening in the world at the time with the Soviet Union and everything that was going on there. And then you've got Gene Hackman playing this character that is essentially like a corporate spy, like in the corporate espionage business, and is then roped into or becomes a part of this international operation, right? And there's a part of this film that I enjoyed. There's a sort of I don't want to say timeliness. What's the word? Like, there's a reminiscence of what the world was like at that time that I have a sense of, I think I was old enough to understand like things were going on in the world and things were changing. And so this lives right in that moment, but it's also, it's kind of an odd mix of like sort of like a dry comedy, but also with like some more like international geopolitical intrigue to it. And I don't know. I'm not really sure how I feel about this one. You could see like just a few years before this, we had The Package. There were a couple other films, Class Action, I remember coming out, I think probably the same year. But then right after this, you have Unforgiven. You have The Firm. You have films that speak to like good choices or at least good execution of ideas. This one, I don't know. It's a weird place. I really, for the longest time, I always thought this film came out earlier, like in the 80s, not in 1991. And so when we get into the 2000s, there's a film here that is such an interesting, sort of surprising move where it's David Mamet, right? Who's known for, he's known as a playwright, but he's known for his dialogue, his sort of like biting characters and the sort of, intensity that he brings to dramatic stories, right? Here, this film Heist, you've got Gene Hackman, got Danny DeVito, Delroy Lindo, Ricky Jay, Sam Rockwell, young Sam Rockwell. Enough people here that bring some dramatic power that you would think a heist film is a great place to let these people just, have at it, right? But this film, I think, for David Mamet, I feel like he's great at crafting dialogue and crafting these sort of dynamics between characters. But here, this film, I think it tries to do a lot of work in terms of the actual job, right? The heist, the score. And for a minute, I confused this with a film called The Score, which has got its own big cast of De Niro, Edward Norton, Marlon Brando, Angela Bassett, right? That's a great film. This one, I think it tries to craft a lot around the actual jobs, and yet it's not so much about that. It's about the characters. And unfortunately, I think I want to see a movie called Heist for like a really interesting and entertaining heist. I don't necessarily want to see it for the characters. I feel like this film could have been called something else and might have set some different expectations, might have actually landed better. And so the last film I want to get to is, of course, the last film, which I had never seen. The last film that he's been in to date, and most likely will ever be in, Welcome to Mooseport. And for me, it's a film that, look, I could say like some of these films in the 70s and 80s, like they kind of live in this like TV land territory where they feel very kind of like low budget or just made on the cheap, put it that way. And they feel like they're very kind of slapped together week by week, This one, it feels like a proper film. It looks and has the production quality of anything you might have seen in like a kind of a standard rom-com or wholesome family comedy, let's say, of the early 2000s, maybe even earlier into the 90s. The thing that kind of tips it off, though, is like, aside from Gene Hackman, everybody else in the film are TV actors, you know, and here's where, like, I see Gene Hackman living in his lane. He is the former president who returns to his hometown of Mooseport, and he's kind of pressured into running for mayor of this small town. And of course, there's a whole like element, like publicity wise, that, oh, you know, this would be a good thing to do. It's going to look good. I'm going through other things. I've had my own issues as president. So here I can kind of write some of that or whatever. And yet he's running against the local like plumber or whatever, who is Ray Romano. And he's also kind of struck up a weird kind of dynamic with the girlfriend of the plumber of the town, played by Moira Tierney. And, you know, I mean, look, everybody in this film is from TV shows, whether it's Fred Savage from The Wonder Years, or was it Christine Baranski? What was the show she was in? Well, she's been in a few shows, but, you know, all these people have been in TV shows. And I just think, on one hand, it kind of works because it's kind of like stunt casting, right? It's like, if it wasn't Gene Hackman's film, who would it be? So Gene Hackman is clearly like the guy that, oh, all these other, like, not even the characters, the performers are looking up towards. You're from another stratosphere. And so there's just a different sort of game that they're playing. But at the same time, it's like, there's really no sense that Gene Hackman is in the right league here. Like, he's kind of head and shoulders above everybody else in this. And it's not so much the performers at that point. It is about the characters. Like, there's really no way this character is going to do wrong. And yet the film tries to find it. You know, the story tries to find ways to not make him the good guy or make him possibly the bad guy. And even to the point where he's running against this man, the plumber of the town, and this triangle type of thing starts to happen where, oh, the former president is interested in my girlfriend, and I've got to run so that I can kind of prove myself to my girlfriend. And so then it becomes a little bit of a weird, like, fight for her. And yet, I mean, there's even a scene where he kind of gets into like a weird gaslighting territory of like, you know, I wouldn't be doing this if it weren't for you, and you're the reason why. And it's a weird kind of like guilt thing that is happening. And I just feel like, it feels kind of gross. Like, make this character own up. You know, that's the other thing about this film. It's not so much about Gene Hackman. Gene Hackman's doing his thing. He's in his lane. It's about Ray Romano and his approach to this character. And that's part of a lot of what he did in his TV show. But it's like, he's this kind of wuss. And he's getting pushed around, and he's getting, I mean, even his girlfriend like hits him in the arm, and he's like, oh. And I'm like, come on, man. Don't be such a bitch. And I think that's, of course, for comedic effect, but it's like, I can't take you seriously now, especially when you're going up against Gene Hackman, who is all about being taken serious. Even when he's being funny or being charismatic, you still got to take him serious. And so I just think this film is just a weird mix of things. It has such a light touch to it that I don't know who this film really would have been for. I mean, maybe if this film would have come out like 10 years earlier, right? Like 1994, I think that would have been a better spot for this to land. Because, I mean, think about it. 2004, this is right at the beginning or just the kind of early stages of like the Judd Apatow comedy wave. Right? Like, comedies are going in a whole different direction, and they're for younger people, and they're for people with a different sensibility. And this film, it feels like so out of date. And I think even watching it today, 20 years later, it really doesn't work now. Like, this would be like a Hallmark type movie. It's so light touch. And yet you feel like there's the kernel of something that's really actually fun and even kind of subversive, or, you know, a satire in a way. And this one, it just plays it. It just kind of sits there, you know? So I guess where I come at with all these films that I've talked about, these new films, is that other than the package, I think a lot of these films, they kind of went under the radar, maybe with good reason. And it's not to say they weren't good efforts, but I just think they don't hold up. You know, they might have worked in the day, in the 80s, in the 90s, maybe. I don't think Welcome to Mooseport ever worked, really. But I think there's a reason why the films that I listed earlier, those films that I know of that I kind of hung on to, those have been able to stand the test of time. And so for me, it's like, well, look, I know a lot of people say, well, that's the last film we got with Gene Hackman, Welcome to Mooseport. You can't, I mean, you could look at it that way if you want. I think it's more about all the great films we got over the years, you know, from the 70s. I mean, he was even in Bonnie and Clyde for a minute. So, you know, the 60s, 70s, 80s, the 90s, you know, there's a lot of films in there that work and mean something to a lot of people, I suppose. So I think overall, it's like I just wanted to talk about some of these films and I don't know, I think really show a little appreciation or a lot of appreciation for Gene Hackman and his work. I mean, he's somebody that I think is such a unique, one of a kind actor that I don't know that we'll really see many people like that in the future. Because that's something to keep in mind is like, you know, Gene Hackman didn't really hit as a presence, as a name in terms of his own, let's say, career. I mean, until he was in his 40s, right? The French Connection, 1971, he was 41 years old. And it's like, he'd been a working actor before that. I can look up credits on IMDb, but it's like, what did I notice him in? What did people see him in? And that's where we are. And so if you say 1971 to 2004, that's still over 30 years of films that he's been in. And some of them have been, whether you're talking about box office or you're talking about acclaim, you know, critical notice, you know, come on, Superman, for that time, like there wasn't a bigger film. Okay, maybe Star Wars, I guess. But that was the kind of beginning of all this superhero stuff that we've been dealing with for the last 10, 15 years. It really started way back then with Superman. Or you're talking about something like Unforgiven or The French Connection, The Conversation. Like all these films, they've meant something to a lot of different people for different reasons. But this is what you get when you have a career that's so kind of varied, you know? So anyway, that's a little bit of a trip down the Gene Hackman lane. Look, if you want to hear some other episodes about plenty of other films with other actors, other filmmakers, you go to filmstreak.com. You can listen to other episodes there. You can sign up to get these by email, subscribe, do all that. I've got a list of all these films on IMDb, so you can check that out. And we're wrapping up the year. Stay warm, stay cool, go watch something new.